Hi, I'm Dr. Philip Macmillan. Thank you very much for joining me today. And I'm going to be asking a hard historical question about Omicron, the origin of Omicron, and why it appeared in southern Africa at the time. Now, for many people, there has been so many things that have happened over the past 3 years that it is difficult to keep up. That's where I come in. I will always try and keep you up to date on information around COVID 19. My approach to the research had always took me to autoimmunity as the primary mechanism for severe COVID 19, and it means I always have a different perspective from what you may see elsewhere. So let's start with this question. And the first place to start is probably what Reuters has been saying in the past few months. And I've brought up here a recent article that was done. This is January 9th, 2023. Fact checked. No evidence vaccination efforts are causing new COVID 19 variants. And it's because there's a video going around saying that the new variants of COVID 19 are formed to sidestep the antibodies created by the global vaccination drive. But scientific evidence thus far does not support the claim. Well, as you know, Reuters is always right. So, therefore, there should be no further consideration as to what could be driving these Omicron variants. Well, let's ask a few simple questions with regards to what happens with Omicron. When we go back in time, and I went all the way back to September 2021, what was happening at that time? And why was this relevant only a few months later? Well, when we actually look at the vaccination drive, and I've got this from your world in our world in data, and you can see here, this is the global vaccination drive. This is December 2020. You can see the rise here going all the way up, and it peaks in June 2023. It goes down. There's another peak here in August, and then a further peak in August, late August, and then a precipitous drop all the way down to October. There seemed to be a fatigue that was occurring across the world. People were no longer taking the pandemic as seriously as they should. Well, what do you do in a situation like that? You try and raise the concerns in the population. And so, what did they do? And this is now me bringing up a Bloomberg article at that time. So, at that time, you can see here this Bloomberg article. The unvaccinated are a risk to all of us. This was done by Kristen Brown, 5th of September 2021. One vaccine makes more antibodies than another, and the Delta surge. But here is the main thing: the unvaccinated are a risk to all of us. And they are hearing that the longer they have unvaccinated people around, the more likely it is that a new COVID variant will develop that resists vaccines. Is that true? And of course, this seemed to be substantiated by the CDC, saying they couldn't be sure, but they thought that there were hotspots that could make this more likely. So that was the news in September 2021. And just so that you remember what happened, is that by December, we had the first news about Omicron. It was actually late November, and when we look at what happened, you can see here. This is bringing it back to the full screen of our world in data. Suddenly, it peaks again by December 2021. Everybody started to get worried, and then it falls off when they hear that Omicron is not so serious. It created an issue. So the first question is, were they right about the unvaccinated causing this incredibly significant risk of these variants, especially Omicron? Why would Omicron just suddenly appear in Southern Africa? Now, at the time, it didn't make sense to me. because there was already some evidence showing that if you looked at variants, viral variants, comparing the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, you'd find that there were more variants in the unvaccinated than the vaccinated. And this was being said that, whoa, look at that. It's because the unvaccinated are causing more variants. I looked at it differently. I said, well, why would the vaccinated have less variants? Clearly, because their immune system after vaccination would pick off certain variants and not allow them to be able to develop, which makes perfect sense. And that's why you would have less variants with the vaccinated. The question is, what happens to those variants that evaded the antibodies? Would they put everyone else at greater risk? And this is technically what the Reuters article is challenging and saying, no, vaccination had no impact in it. Well, let's look at the science. Here is what the science shows about Omicron. So this here is an image with regards to the fact of SARS-CoV-2 primarily having two entry routes to get into the cell. This one here is the cell surface entry, and this uses an enzyme, TMPRSS, and it very quickly allows the virus to join with the cell membrane and release the RNA. This is very quick, very efficient. What's interesting is that all of the variants prior to Omicron use this mechanism. Omicron, however, uses a completely different entry mechanism. It doesn't use TMPRSS, it binds to ACE2, and then it gets endocytosed in this bubble. Then this is acidified, and then it's releasing its RNA, which can then be replicated. This process is slower. Why would the virus completely change the entry mechanism if this wasn't blocked? And this is one of the things that we had found when they looked at the antibodies. They found that the furin cleavage site, which the TMPRSS would use, that antibody is one of the highest antibodies produced in the vaccinated. So it makes sense that this mechanism of entry for the virus into the cell is no longer as accessible. And so the virus finds another way, which is the origins of Omicron. What we can't say for certain is whether or not this was definitively caused by vaccination. We can only presume. But why would it in any case turn up in southern Africa? That was the other part of the question that puzzled me at the time, because there was no reason for the virus to change its entry. At that point, Africa only had 2% vaccination penetration. And there was a complaint, certainly from the WHO, that Africa was not getting the opportunity to be vaccinated. So they weren't vaccinated. And so, therefore, in my view, they shouldn't need to have the virus using a different variant to get in. It could use the same strategy it used before. So here is an interesting article, again from Reuters. And in this article, this is talking about what happened with Botswana. Now, in Botswana, they were as well one of the first places, along with South Africa, to find the Omicron variant. And they were upset that they were penalized by it. And if you remember carefully, they banned the flights from Africa because of the fact that Omicron was there. But Botswana found something interesting. Diplomats found to have Omicron variant came from Europe. And so Botswana's president at the time, there were 4 diplomats who first tested positive for the Omicron coronavirus variant in the country had come from Europe. And they were calling for reversal of the widespread travel bans imposed against Southern African countries. Now, isn't that interesting? Here we have the fact is that in Botswana, when they first found Omicron, it was actually in diplomats. And as far as I know, the diplomats had come from Europe. Now, they played the story down because they were not trying to escalate the problem. They were just saying that it is not fair that because of the sophisticated techniques that South Africa was using in terms of viral sequencing, that they first identify Omicron and then become penalized for it. But this was an incredible opportunity to blow up the story. And why would it be relevant? Again, I take you back to what seems to be the most important piece of the puzzle. Again, I remind you that right after, you have the highest peak after the trough in October. That's when everybody started to go and get vaccinated because they were concerned about the risks of Omicron. But as the news started to filter out that Omicron seemed to almost have a milder presentation, this interest from the public started to wane again. But here is another important fact that you have to understand. When we think of Omicron and its circulation, at this point, remember the date, December 2021, our most infective variant spreads across the world. Where is it circulating? Up to March 2023, that is before Johns Hopkins closed their site, I caught this image. This is in March, and it shows you here that the areas that had the highest circulation of Omicron were North America, Europe, and to some degree South America. When you look at the unvaccinated portion of Africa, you don't see that occurring. And the science behind that is quite simple. This here is a picture of a variant. And this was the early variants that had occurred. And this was gotten from BioRender. And I appreciate that they had been able to do that. But what they're showing here is all the variants that occur on the spike protein, because that's where the variants occur, on the spike protein. But in order to get that picture about how the body actually works, remind yourself of this fact. This is the virus. This is the cross section of the virus. This is the spike protein. There are multiple other proteins on the surface of the virus. There's the nucleocapsid protein inside. There's the membrane protein on top. There's an envelope protein here. And all of these, the body makes antibodies to as well. And so what then happens is that even if there are variations in the spike protein, in the unvaccinated with natural immunity, they can still pick up the M proteins, the envelope proteins on the surface of the virus, and still be able to neutralize it quickly. And that would explain why, even though Africa was unvaccinated and had the first cases of Omicron, instead of it becoming a major issue, what then seems to have happened for Africa is that they ended up with technically a natural herd immunity from the spread of Omicron. And that's where we are today. And so it raises the question, Omicron ending up in Africa doesn't make sense unless it was brought there. And the evidence seems to suggest that it was brought from Europe to Africa. And I think that the Johns Hopkins details in March 2023 seems to corroborate that. In a strange way, it's strange how science and life works. It was almost used as a target for Africa, that they were unvaccinated and therefore producing variants and therefore needed to be banned. In the end, Africa seems to have won. The rest of the world seems to still be struggling. We'll wait for Reuters and other scientists to explain to us why. At this point, I can only speculate, and I'll leave you to speculate as well. And I'd encourage you to keep on following me, posts, videos, and podcasts on Substack if you want to hear more innovative angles of thinking. Have a great evening.